Repetitiveness is my job.
Want to level up your weathering? Well, you've come to the right place, because today I'm going to show you the tricks and techniques I use to bring this half-track alive. Don't let the size of this model fool you, it is quite the marathon, but fear not, because we are now on the home stretch and this is where the fun begins.
Games begin.
Time to prime, and I've gone with my usual black primer to set the foundations. I'm using the newly released VMS primer because it is a little easier to control than my usual rattle can. It's a great option for those of you looking for a less toxic option to some of those solvent-based primers. A sponge block has also been stuffed into that open top section to mask the paint, as well as some small pieces through the open hatches. And just like I used for the interior, I mixed together my formula for the Panzer grey. Roughly speaking, it's about a 3:1 ratio of the dark grey and the white grey, and I apply it in that mottled fashion. As I mentioned in the early videos, Panzer grey was a very dark grey. However, I found this lightened tone to be the perfect base to build my weathering effects over. There will be so many layers going over this foundation that any imperfection in that colour and finish will just help to create textures and variation over the model. By then adding progressively more of that white grey to the mix, I'm able to produce the highlights over the horizontal surfaces and along those top and leading edges. When applying highlights, it's important to remember to keep the paint well thinned. The thinner the paint is, the more translucent the paint will be, and allow for nice smooth gradients over the various highlights. Hopefully these techniques aren't sounding a bit too repetitive, as I share them in just about every video I make, but I find great joy in painting with the airbrush, so I would hope you are experimenting with your finishes on your own models. It's always good practice to apply a gloss coat prior to fitting your decals. However, I felt the finish was smooth enough and the decals were small enough to bypass that step. A satin varnish though could then be flood coated over the top to seal them in. I'd forgotten to drill out the exhaust during the construction phase and proceeded to do it now using a micro drill. Small details like this can make a big difference to your model and are a quick and easy upgrade to make. With the masking sponges removed, I moved to the sponge chipping again, just like I did in the interior from the previous video. The colour I'm using here is a Vallejo colour. It's German camouflage black brown. Now I'm applying the same principles I did in the interior with this chipping, considering logical areas of traffic and wear. Slithers of masking tape can be used to isolate the chipping to a single surface. In this example, I am wanting the chips to run down the length of the door, but not to go onto that rear plate. This will define the spaces and tell the story of a moving door being the plate that would suffer the most damage in this instance. Word of caution, however, take care when masking over decals because it has the potential to lift and damage them even though they've been varnished. The tools around the guardrails can now be painted with acrylics. I use cork brown for the wooden handles, rust for the wire cutter handles, and anything metal is painted in a graphite colour. The metal elements will be subject to washes that will give them their colour at a later stage, so fear not if the grey looks a little odd at this point. For painting the tarps, I used a combination of colours taken from the AK Gen 3 acrylic sets. Each one is painted in a different but similar tone just for variation. A canvas tone, a field grey. The tarp on the front right guard is painted in that splinter camouflage pattern, and sets like these AK sets make these colour selections a really easy process. It's just then a matter of trying to paint in that disruptive shape as you see them on the box and then add the fine splinters. It's surprising how easy this is to get a reasonable looking result. Definite room for improvement, but satisfying nonetheless. AK Terrain's muddy ground will form the base for the mud around the vehicle. It provides just about the perfect foundation for the dark earth colours of that Russian countryside I'm going to pose the vehicle in. I mix clippings of seagrass in with the paste. Now the seagrass balls can be hard to come by now as AK discontinued them from their line. They can be found washed up on the beach in some places, so be sure to keep an eye out for them. Substituting them with tea leaves and short clippings of static grass would be an acceptable alternative though. Adding the clippings to the paste will add volume and a more organic nature to the look. It will also make the paste a little easier to shape and to work with. The Terrain's paste is water-based, so keeping the brush and the mix reasonably wet will extend your working window with it. It's applied over the underside, and I'm keeping to the edges here, and it's also applied in and around the spaces behind that running gear. As always, use a degree of logic with this application. Now it's important to move reasonably quickly and focus on one area at a time because the paste will dry quickly, and unlike enamel based products you can't reactivate it. Once it's dry, it's dry. While it's still wet, I use a wet sponge to feather the edges so that transition from the mud to the colour of the vehicle is a relatively smooth one. Now although not exclusively, I am generally speaking keeping this coverage from the track guard down, so it is really only the bottom third of the vehicle getting treated to this mud bath. Wheels and tracks receive the same treatment, although I'm mindful to keep the application reasonably restrained and see the process more about introducing the colour rather than caking these areas up with mud. Using that wet sponge to distribute the paste will help settle the look, but it will also add interesting textures in the layer. More of those seagrass clippings are added to that paste while it's wet to add an even greater organic look to it, but it also adds an interesting variation in the colouring. This should be reasonably understated because I don't want to lose all of those beautiful mud tones, I'm just trying to complement them. I can now attach the wheels, and to add some dynamic to the model, I gently bend the fixing points for those front wheels so I could pose them in a turning position. The mechanics of the steering arm will be incorrect, however, it is a detail that will be hard to see on the finished model, and posing those wheels in a turning position will help build a story and break up the lines of the model. The tracks were completely assembled in the closed circle position, and the drive sprocket, which had been left off the model, is then tucked into place on the track. Then by looping the rear of the track over the idler and capping the teeth over the road wheels, I can find the locating hole for that drive sprocket and glue it in place with a touch of super glue. The edge mud flaps remained intact, however that fine drop down reflector was easily displaced, so maybe leave that off until the tracks have been attached. I seem to have this newfound love for Tamiya washes and used a combination of the black, dark brown and dark grey to re-establish the details around the model. These washes are enamel based and will mix and blend with each other, so there's nothing stopping you from adding the black wash through the recesses and then adding a brown to that if you felt it was looking too heavy. The thing with the Tamiya liners is they seem to dry a lot harder than the oils or some of the other enamel washes available, and what I mean by that is often I could use a makeup sponge to move and modify an AK enamel wash, for instance, whereas to modify and remove the Tamiya liners I have to use a cotton bud moistened with white spirit. By using this method, however, I can get a really defined and tidy wash definition over the details. Removing the other style of enamels or oil paint washes with a makeup sponge can tend to give a softer look to the wash. Back to the seagrass clippings, and they are scattered through recesses and corners over the guardrails. Once they are in plausible and natural looking positions, that VMS sand and ballast freeze is carefully dripped over the piles and let migrate through them. You might have noticed a lot of these techniques mirror what I did on the interior, which I guess should make sense, right? This is a water-based product, so once it is applied, use a brush and water to distribute and blend it at the edges. Failure to do that can leave unwanted lumps and bumps over the areas and look pretty horrible, to be honest. It will also dry quite glossy, so don't panic if that is the case, because a matte varnish will address that shortly. Shout out to John Spud Murphy for reaching out recently with the tip of first applying an acrylic thinner using a pipette and then applying the ballast freeze. That would have avoided me having to blend the product with water, and it's definitely one to try for next time. I mentioned earlier I felt the bedrolls that came with the kit looked a little stiff and unnatural. However, the tarps for the compartment covers look pretty amazing to my eye. Granted, there is a risk of hiding all your hard work on the interior by using them, but the smallest one of the three options you get still allowed for a good look inside, and the opportunity to add some colour over the top of the vehicle was too good to refuse. I also liked the way the tarp peaked over the machine gun bracket, as it introduced a new shape to the model. This was painted in that splinter camouflage base colour and highlighted by adding light grey and mixing that with a glaze medium. And once attached, the tarp received a light wash using the AK wash for Africa Core vehicles. As mentioned, the tools had been painted in the graphite colour, although I think a lighter grey may have worked a little better. An all-over wash using rust streaks and light rust are then wet blended over the grey parts, and then a sponge is dabbed over that wet paint. A touch of white spirit on the sponge will help blend and feather the rusted colours and allow that grey to show through and give a pretty convincing look to the metal tools. I will add a touch of gunmetal pigment or possibly add some scuffs using a lead pencil after those enamels have dried. The model can then receive an all-over matte varnish. Adding streaking effects to a model adds a sense of age and an indistinct tied look to the finish. I first add small lines of oil paint in the vertical position over the sides. I'm using white, dust, burnt sienna and a shadow brown to create these effects. The rusty browns are applied where there may be like a tie down or bracket or a latch, or even where there may have been a heavy chip from the sponge chipping effects I applied earlier. The white and dust colours tend to work better over the flat surfaces. A flat brush with the slightest hint of white spirit is then worked in that up and down motion to blend and soften the streak. By cutting away at the edges of the streak rather than just going over the whole thing, I'm able to maintain some volume and shape to it. This is similar to the oil dot filter, however, with that technique I'm creating an all-over tint. With this, I'm looking to create a visible streak. With the oil paint still fresh in the palette, the shadow brown and the dust are used to create even greater depth in that grey finish. This should be working with the shading and the highlights from the paintwork and adding another layer over the model. Small amounts of the dust are applied around the front horizontal corner as well as around the machine gun position, and this is then dry blended into the surface with a soft brush. This is done with a simple grinding motion of that brush. Now the oil paint is soft, so it shouldn't take too much to blend it into the surface. The shadow brown is used to great effect around that back corner of the engine armour. Now I'm using a dark brown in those corners and recesses and the dust in the more open spaces. This technique works best when you are selective with its application rather than using it over every surface. Work in small sections and assess often. I take comfort in the fact that because I'm using oils over lacquers and acrylics, I can easily remove it with a cotton bud with white spirit if I'm not satisfied with the finish. AK Earth Effects is then applied in a random fashion over the wheels and the running gear. Now, I'm not wanting to completely cover the mud effects, but complement and enhance them with this earthen colour. These enamels tend to dry a little bit darker than they go on, so don't be concerned if it isn't looking exactly how you might think it will. Once the enamel is dry, a cotton bud and white spirit can be used to remove some of that effect around the tyres and make the deposits look a little more natural. You can also use a soft brush and work the paint from the rim to the outside of the wheel to give an interesting finish. This wash can also be introduced around the piles of that seagrass and debris I installed over the guardrails earlier to integrate that lighter earthy tone over the model. The gun and other metallic objects can then be polished using a gunmetal pigment, either with a cotton bud or the tips of your fingers. I can also use a graphite stick and a lead pencil where greater control is required. And then some exhaust staining with a thinned mix of clear smoke and the hatches posed in the open position. Plus I've added a 1.4 meter aerial to the aerial mount, and I think I'm just about done. It's not too often I build a model and it comes out looking exactly how I'd hoped for, but I'm pleased to say this little half-track has turned out to be the exception. Of course, I have a vision for every model I build, but more often than not, the look and finish tend to evolve and take a life of their own. It amazes me how modelers can overlook or underestimate monotone schemes as being too easy or maybe too boring to paint. But a single colour scheme presents so many opportunities to introduce light and shade and play with tonal variation to create something really unique. Plus it gives you the perfect platform to build your weathering effects over. In terms of a kit, this Takom Halftrack is absolutely gorgeous, with just about every detail having been considered. As mentioned though, this is a kit that has the potential to test the modeler with a load of small assemblies, as well as the considerations that have to be made in order to execute it properly. But honestly, don't let that turn you off, because the engineering in this kit is of an extremely high level and hopefully, as you can see, turns out to be an impressive little model. Now, I hope you enjoyed this build as much as I have, and be sure to let me know in the comments down below if there was something that you felt you picked up or learnt along the way. I'd love to know, so please comment down below. Now, shout out to my Patreon crew who have been well across this build along the way. Over there, you have the opportunity to dial into regular bench updates, ad-free videos, and additional content with a tier to suit every budget. Plus, you can get in touch with me through the direct messages. The support I get through that Patreon page helps me bring you this content on a regular basis, and I really couldn't do it without them. So if you think you could help out, I would love to see you over on that page. So what's next, I hear you say? Well, why not head over to the Patreon page and find out. So remember guys, this is the greatest hobby in the world. Share it with your family and share it with your friends, and let's be proud of what we do. Until next time, I will see you soon.
Feel pretty happy.